The airport was buzzing with the usual chaos of a busy Thursday afternoon. People rushed past with their rolling suitcases, coffee cups in hand, checking their phones every few seconds. Gate 23 was packed with travelers waiting for Flight 447 to Atlanta. 14-year-old Kevin sat quietly in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his backpack clutched tightly on his lap. This was his first time flying alone, and the butterflies in his stomach felt more like eagles. His mom had given him a pep talk that morning, reminding him that he was brave and smart, and that his grandmother would be waiting for him with her famous peach cobbler. Kevin pulled out his phone and reread the text from his mom for the third time.
"You got this, baby?
Call me when you land. Love you." He smiled despite his nerves. The trip was supposed to be fun. 2 weeks with Grandma Betty in her cozy house in Atlanta, helping her with her garden and listening to her stories about the old days. The boarding announcement crackled through the speakers, and Kevin's heart started beating faster. He checked his boarding pass again. Seat 14B, middle seat. He'd hoped for a window seat, but his mom had booked the flight last minute when Grandma Betty had her surgery moved up. As Kevin stood in line, he noticed the man in front of him. Tall, probably in his 50s, wearing an expensive-looking suit and carrying a leather briefcase that screamed business. The man kept looking back at Kevin with this expression Kevin couldn't quite read. Not friendly, that was for sure. When they finally boarded the plane, Kevin followed the flow of passengers down the narrow aisle. The plane seemed smaller inside than it looked from the outside. Flight attendants smiled and welcomed everyone aboard, their uniforms crisp and professional. Kevin found row 14 and saw that the man from the line was settling into seat 14A, the aisle seat. Kevin's stomach dropped a little. Something about the man's energy felt off, but Kevin tried to stay positive. Maybe the guy was just having a bad day. "Excuse me," Kevin said politely. "I think I'm in the middle seat." The man, whose name tag from some conference read Robert, looked up with clear annoyance. He didn't move his legs or make any effort to let Kevin pass easily. Kevin had to awkwardly squeeze by, bumping slightly into Robert's briefcase. "Watch it," Robert muttered under his breath, loud enough for Kevin to hear. Kevin settled into his seat and immediately felt the tension. Robert had claimed both armrests and was spreading out like he owned the entire row. His newspaper was folded in a way that invaded Kevin's space, and he kept sighing heavily, as if Kevin's very presence was ruining his day. The window seat was occupied by Mrs. Patterson, a sweet elderly lady who smiled warmly at Kevin. "First time flying alone, honey?" she asked kindly. "Yes, ma'am," Kevin replied, grateful for her friendly voice. "I'm going to visit my grandmother in Atlanta." "How wonderful. I bet she's excited to see you." Robert rolled his eyes and made a noise of irritation. He adjusted his position, deliberately bumping Kevin's arm off the armrest. Kevin looked at him confused, but Robert was staring straight ahead, pretending nothing had happened. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Kevin was having trouble concentrating. Robert kept making these little comments under his breath, too quiet for others to hear but clearly meant for Kevin. Things like, "Great, just great," and "This is exactly what I needed." Kevin tried to focus on the safety video, watching the flight attendant demonstrate how to put on the life jacket. He'd never been on a plane before, so he wanted to pay attention. But Robert's negative energy was like a dark cloud sitting right next to him. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Kevin felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The engines got louder, and he could feel the aircraft moving. This was it, his first flight. He should have been thrilled, but instead he found himself wishing he could switch seats. Robert pulled out his phone and started typing aggressively, his elbows taking up even more space. When the flight attendant asked everyone to put their devices in airplane mode, Robert complied, but with obvious frustration, like even following basic rules was beneath him. The plane started down the runway and Kevin gripped his armrest tightly. The acceleration was incredible, unlike anything he'd ever felt. Despite the uncomfortable situation with his seatmate, Kevin couldn't help but smile as they lifted off the ground. He was actually flying. Mrs. Patterson noticed his excitement. "Beautiful view today," she said, gesturing toward the window. "Would you like to take a look?" Kevin leaned over slightly to see out the window, careful not to invade her space. The ground was getting smaller and smaller below them. Houses looked like tiny toys and cars moved like ants along the highways. It was amazing. Incredible, Kevin whispered. Robert made another annoyed sound and shifted in his seat, making it clear that Kevin's wonder was bothering him somehow. Kevin couldn't understand what he'd done wrong. He was being polite, staying in his own space as much as possible and not bothering anyone. Once they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants began their service. Robert ordered a whiskey even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. Kevin asked for a Coke, saying please and thank you, just like his mother had taught him. The flight attendant, a kind woman named Lisa, smiled at Kevin. First time flying? Yes, ma'am. I'm visiting my grandmother. That's so sweet. You're very well-mannered, young man. Robert snorted quietly, taking a sip of his whiskey. Kevin pretended not to notice, but the man's attitude was starting to really bother him. He pulled out a book from his backpack, hoping to distract himself with the adventure story his English teacher had recommended. As Kevin tried to read, he became increasingly aware of Robert's hostile energy. The man kept glancing over at him, and every small movement Kevin made seemed to irritate him further. When Kevin adjusted his position to get more comfortable, Robert sighed dramatically. When Kevin turned a page in his book, Robert shook his head like Kevin was doing something wrong. Mrs. Patterson had fallen asleep against the window, leaving Kevin feeling somewhat isolated between her peaceful presence and Robert's growing hostility. Kevin tried to focus on his book, but the words were becoming harder to concentrate on. The worst part was that Kevin couldn't understand why this stranger disliked him so much. He'd been nothing but polite. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet Robert's behavior was making it clear that Kevin's presence was unwelcome. Kevin glanced around the plane, noticing other passengers reading, sleeping, or chatting quietly with their companions. Everyone seemed relaxed and comfortable. Everyone except Robert, whose tension was becoming more obvious by the minute. As the flight continued, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was building. Robert's muttered comments were getting slightly louder, and his body language was becoming more aggressive. Kevin had encountered people like this before. People who seemed to have a problem with him for reasons he couldn't control or understand. He thought about his mother's advice about dealing with difficult people. Kill them with kindness, she always said. Don't let other people's problems become your problems. But sitting trapped in this middle seat, Kevin was starting to wonder if kindness would be enough. 30 minutes into the flight, the tension had only gotten worse. Robert was now openly staring at Kevin whenever the boy moved, his face twisted into a permanent scowl. Kevin tried his best to make himself smaller in the already cramped middle seat, but there was nowhere to go. The book in Kevin's hands had become more of a shield than entertainment. He held it up, trying to create a barrier between himself and Robert's hostile energy, but even turning the pages seemed to annoy the man sitting next to him. Could you stop that? Robert suddenly said, his voice sharp and much louder than before. Kevin looked up, confused. Stop what, sir? That constant moving around, fidgeting. It's disturbing other passengers. Kevin glanced around. The plane was calm and quiet. Other passengers were reading, watching movies on their tablets or sleeping peacefully. No one seemed disturbed by anything Kevin was doing. I'm sorry, Kevin said quietly, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. I was just reading. Well, read somewhere else, Robert snapped. The comment made no sense. Kevin was in his assigned seat, doing nothing wrong. Mrs. Patterson stirred slightly in the window seat but remained asleep. Kevin looked down at his book, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. His mother had taught him to respect adults, but she'd also taught him to stand up for himself when necessary. This felt like one of those gray areas where he wasn't sure which rule applied. Robert took another sip of his whiskey and pulled out his phone, despite the fact that they were supposed to keep devices in airplane mode. He started typing angrily, his thumbs hitting the screen harder than necessary. Some people have no consideration, Robert muttered, still loud enough for Kevin to hear. No respect for others. Kevin felt his face getting hot. The comment was clearly directed at him, but he had no idea what he'd done to deserve such treatment. He'd been quiet, polite, and had stayed in his own space as much as possible. The flight attendant Lisa walked by during her routine check on passengers. Kevin considered saying something to her about Robert's behavior, but his mother had always taught him not to cause trouble if he could avoid it. Maybe things would calm down, but they didn't calm down. If anything, Robert seemed to be adding more agitated as the flight continued. He kept making comments under his breath, just loud enough for Kevin to hear but quiet enough that other passengers wouldn't notice. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," Robert mumbled, shaking his head. "No discipline. No respect." Kevin tried to focus on his book, but the words were swimming on the page. His heart was beating faster, and he could feel that familiar knot forming in his stomach that always appeared when adults were upset with him for reasons he couldn't understand. 20 minutes later, Kevin needed to use the restroom. He'd been holding it, not wanting to bother Robert or cause any more problems. But nature was calling and he couldn't wait any longer. "Excuse me," Kevin said politely. "I need to get up for a minute." Robert looked at him with pure disgust.
Seriously?
"We just took off. I'm sorry, sir. I just need to use the restroom." Robert made a big show of moving his legs, sighing heavily and acting like Kevin was asking him to climb Mount Everest. As Kevin squeezed past, trying to be as careful as possible, his elbow accidentally bumped against Robert's arm. It was the smallest contact imaginable, barely a brush. Kevin immediately turned back to apologize. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to. Robert's voice exploded across the cabin, causing several passengers to look up from their activities. "You did that on purpose." Kevin's eyes went wide. "No, sir, I really didn't. It was an accident." "Don't lie to me, boy." Robert's face was red now and his voice was getting louder. "I saw exactly what you did. You think you can just bump into people and get away with it?" The words hit Kevin like a slap. The way Robert said "boy" had a tone Kevin had heard before, a tone that made his skin crawl. This wasn't just about an accidental bump. This was about something else entirely. "Sir, I promise it was an accident," Kevin said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was just trying to get by." "Trying to get by?" Robert stood up now, towering over Kevin in the narrow aisle. "You people always have an excuse, don't you?" The phrase "you people" hung in the air like poison. Kevin felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. He understood now what this was really about, and the realization made him feel sick. Other passengers were definitely watching now. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and glancing away. Others pulled out their phones, though whether to help or just record Kevin couldn't tell. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Kevin said, trying to keep his voice steady. His mother had taught him to stay calm in difficult situations, even when his heart was pounding like it was now. "No misunderstanding at all," Robert snarled. "I know exactly what you're doing." "Think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" "Well, not on my flight." Kevin looked around desperately for help. A few passengers were watching with concern, but no one was stepping in. The flight attendants were busy in the galley area and hadn't noticed the commotion yet. Mrs. Patterson had woken up and was looking at the scene with confusion and worry. "What's going on here?" she asked softly. "Just dealing with someone who doesn't know how to behave properly," Robert said, his eyes never leaving Kevin's face. Kevin felt tears threatening to form behind his eyes, but he fought them back. He wouldn't give Robert the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried one more time to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, I really am sorry about bumping into you. It won't happen again. I'll be more careful." "Careful?" Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You wouldn't know careful if it hit you in the face. Your kind never does." The words were like a knife twisting in Kevin's chest. He'd heard language like this before, usually from people who looked at him and saw only his skin color instead of seeing him as a person, but never on an airplane, never trapped in such a small space with nowhere to go. Kevin glanced toward the front of the plane, hoping to catch a flight attendant's attention, but they were still busy with their service. He looked back at the other passengers, silently pleading for someone to help, but most had gone back to pretending they weren't watching. Robert sat back down heavily, but his body language remained aggressive and threatening.
"Sit down and stay in your lane," he growled.
"And keep your hands to yourself." Kevin wanted to remind Robert that he still needed to use the restroom, but the man's hostility was so intense that Kevin decided he could wait. He carefully squeezed back into his seat, making sure not to make any contact with Robert whatsoever. As he settled back into the middle seat, Kevin felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The excitement of his first flight had been completely crushed by Robert's hatred. What should have been an adventure had turned into a nightmare. Mrs. Patterson reached over and gently patted Kevin's arm. "Are you okay, honey?" she whispered. Kevin nodded, not trusting his voice. He wasn't okay, but he didn't know what else to do. He was trapped on this plane for another hour and a half with a man who clearly hated him for reasons that had nothing to do with an accidental bump. Robert ordered another whiskey when the flight attendant came by, and Kevin noticed his hands were shaking slightly with anger. The man was getting more intoxicated and more hostile by the minute. Kevin tried to return to his book, but the words meant nothing now. All he could think about was getting through the rest of this flight and getting to his grandmother's house, where he would be safe and loved. But as he sat there, feeling Robert's hatred radiating from the seat next to him, Kevin had a terrible feeling that this confrontation was far from over. The atmosphere in row 14 had become suffocating. Kevin sat rigid in his middle seat, afraid to move even an inch. Robert's anger seemed to be growing with each passing minute, fueled by the alcohol and whatever hatred was burning inside him. Kevin tried to focus on the gentle hum of the plane's engines, anything to distract himself from the hostile energy radiating from the seat beside him. Mrs. Patterson kept glancing over with concern, but she seemed uncertain about what to do. Kevin didn't blame her. What could an elderly woman do against a man Robert's size? The flight attendants continued their service, unaware of the tension building in row 14. They moved efficiently down the aisle, offering snacks and drinks with professional smiles. Kevin watched them hopefully, waiting for someone in authority to notice what was happening. Robert finished his second whiskey and immediately flagged down the flight attendant for another. His movements were becoming more aggressive, and Kevin could smell the alcohol on his breath. The man's face was flushed red and his eyes had taken on a dangerous gleam. "Sir, I think you might want to slow down on the drinks, Lisa," the flight attendant suggested gently. "We still have over an hour left in the flight." Robert's response was immediate and sharp. "I can handle my liquor just fine, thank you. Unlike some people, I know how to behave properly." He shot a meaningful look at Kevin as he said this. Lisa followed his gaze, confused, but didn't press the issue. She handed Robert his third whiskey and moved on to the next row. Kevin's hands were trembling slightly as he held his book. He could feel Robert staring at him, could sense the man's growing agitation. Every instinct Kevin had was telling him that something bad was about to happen. "Put that book away," Robert suddenly demanded. Kevin looked up, startled. "I'm sorry?" "I said put it away. All that page-turning is driving me crazy." Kevin hadn't turned a page in at least 10 minutes. He'd been too nervous to actually read anything. But he closed the book anyway, hoping to avoid another confrontation. "There," Kevin said quietly. "Is that better?" But nothing was going to be better. Robert was past the point of reason now. The alcohol had lowered his inhibitions, and whatever hatred he'd been keeping barely contained was starting to spill over. "Don't get smart with me," Robert snarled. "I've had enough of your attitude." Kevin felt like he was in some kind of nightmare. He hadn't shown any attitude. He'd been nothing but polite and accommodating, even in the face of Robert's obvious hostility. But pointing this out would only make things worse. "I'm sorry if I've upset you somehow," Kevin said carefully. "I really don't mean to cause any problems." "Problems?" Robert's voice was getting louder again. "You've been nothing but problems since you sat down. Thinking you own the place, taking up space where you don't belong." The word sent a chill down Kevin's spine. The meaning was crystal clear, and several other passengers were starting to turn and look. Kevin felt exposed and vulnerable, like everyone on the plane was suddenly judging him. Mrs. Patterson had heard enough. "Now see here, young man," she said to Robert, her voice shaky but determined. "This boy hasn't done anything wrong. He's been perfectly polite." Robert turned his rage toward her. "Stay out of this, lady. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when I see someone being treated unfairly," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious fear. Robert's face twisted with fury. "Unfairly? You want to talk about unfair? I paid good money for this seat and I shouldn't have to put up with this." He gestured aggressively toward Kevin, who was now pressed as far back in his seat as possible. The boy's heart was racing, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. "Put up with what?" Mrs. Patterson demanded. "A child reading a book?" "A child who doesn't know his place," Robert shot back, his voice now loud enough that half the plane could hear him. The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. Kevin could feel dozens of eyes on him and he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Some passengers looked sympathetic, others uncomfortable, and a few seemed to be reaching for their phones. Kevin tried to make himself as small as possible, but there was nowhere to hide. He was trapped between Mrs. Patterson and Robert, with no escape route and no way to defend himself against the man's escalating aggression. "Please," Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just want to get to my grandmother." Something about Kevin's quiet plea seemed to enrage Robert even further. Maybe it was the vulnerability in the boy's voice, or maybe he saw Kevin's fear as weakness to be exploited. "Your grandmother?" Robert sneered. "Well, she should have taught you some manners. Should have taught you to respect your betters. That's when it happened. Without warning, Robert's hand shot out and struck Kevin across the face. The slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, and Kevin's head snapped to the side from the force of it. Gasps and shocked exclamations erupted from nearby passengers. Mrs. Patterson cried out in horror. Kevin's cheek burned from the impact, and his eyes immediately filled with tears of pain and shock. But Robert wasn't finished. Fueled by alcohol and hatred, he grabbed Kevin by the front of his shirt and pulled him forward, shaking him violently. "This is what happens when people like you forget where you belong," Robert shouted, his spit flying in Kevin's face. "You need to learn some respect." Kevin tried to pull away, but Robert's grip was too strong. The man continued shaking him, his other hand raised as if to strike again. Kevin could smell the alcohol on Robert's breath, could see the pure hatred in his eyes. "Stop. Please stop," Kevin managed to cry out, his voice breaking with fear and pain. Other passengers were shouting now, some telling Robert to stop, others calling for the flight attendants. Phones were out, recording the assault as it happened, but no one was physically intervening. They were all frozen by shock or fear or uncertainty about what to do. Mrs. Patterson was hitting Robert's arm with her small fists, trying to make him let go of Kevin, but she was too frail to have any real impact. "Let him go," she kept shouting. "Let him go right now." Robert shoved Kevin back into his seat with such force that the boy's head hit the headrest hard. Stars danced in Kevin's vision, and he could taste blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his tongue. "That's just the beginning," Robert threatened, looming over Kevin with his fist raised. "You want to keep pushing me? See what happens?" Kevin was shaking now, tears streaming down his face. The physical pain was bad enough, but the humiliation of being attacked in front of all these strangers was almost worse. He felt helpless and small and utterly alone. Through his tears, Kevin could see other passengers watching in horror. Some were standing in the aisles now, their faces shocked and angry. A few were arguing with each other about whether to intervene, but the crucial seconds were ticking by and Robert was preparing to strike again. "Where are the flight attendants?" Someone shouted from the back of the plane. "Someone needs to stop this," another passenger called out. But the flight attendants were still in the galley, unaware of the violence erupting in row 14, and Robert, emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, was ready to continue his assault on the frightened boy. Kevin closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for another blow, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was completely at Robert's mercy, and the man clearly had none to give. The plane seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Kevin's fate hung in the balance, dependent on whether someone, anyone, would find the courage to step in and help him. Robert's fist was raised, his face contorted with rage, when suddenly everything changed. Just as Robert's fist began its downward arc toward Kevin's face, a firm hand caught his wrist in midair. The grip was surprisingly strong, stopping Robert's attack completely. "That's enough." The voice was calm but absolutely commanding. Robert spun around to see who dared interfere with him, and found himself face to face with a woman who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. She was probably in her 30s, average height, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Nothing about her physical appearance suggested she could overpower a man like Robert, yet her grip on his wrist was unbreakable. "Let go of me," Robert snarled, trying to jerk his arm free, but the woman held firm. "I'll let go when you step back and calm down," she replied evenly. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to handling difficult situations. "You're assaulting a child, sir. That stops right now." Robert's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "This is none of your business, lady. Mind your own affairs." "When someone attacks a kid in front of me, it becomes my business," the woman said, still maintaining her iron grip on Robert's wrist. She looked down at Kevin with genuine concern. Are you hurt, sweetheart? Kevin nodded, touching his stinging cheek where Robert had struck him. He was still shaking, but the woman's presence had brought him an immediate sense of safety. Someone had finally stepped in to help him. I'm okay, Kevin managed to whisper, though he clearly wasn't. The woman's expression hardened as she looked back at Robert. Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your seat and keep your hands to yourself. If you touch this boy again, you'll have bigger problems than you can imagine. Robert tried again to pull free, but the woman's grip never wavered. Around them, other passengers were watching in amazement. No one had expected this quiet woman to be the one to finally intervene. Who do you think you are? Robert demanded. You can't tell me what to do. My name is Dr. Jennifer Wells, the woman replied calmly. I'm a pediatric psychiatrist, and I've seen enough abused children to know exactly what I'm looking at here. So yes, I can absolutely tell you what to do, and you're going to listen. The title doctor seemed to give some passengers confidence. A few stood up from their seats, moving closer to show their support. The dynamics in the cabin were shifting rapidly. Dr. Wells finally released Robert's wrist, but she positioned herself protectively between him and Kevin. Now, I suggest you sit down, sober up, and think very carefully about your next actions. Robert massaged his wrist, glaring at Dr. Wells with pure hatred. You have no idea who you're dealing with, lady. Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Dr. Wells replied without backing down an inch. I'm dealing with a grown man who thinks it's acceptable to physically assault a child. In my professional opinion, that makes you a coward and a bully. Her words hit Robert like physical blows. He wasn't used to being confronted so directly, especially not by someone who showed no fear of him whatsoever. Other passengers were finding their voices now. A young military officer in civilian clothes stood up from his seat a few rows back. The lady's right, man. You need to back off. An older gentleman with gray hair nodded his agreement. Completely inappropriate behavior. Someone should call the authorities. A mother traveling with 2 young children spoke up from across the aisle. I can't believe what I just witnessed. That poor boy was just sitting there. The tide was turning and Robert could feel it. What had started as his personal confrontation with Kevin had become a public condemnation of his behavior. Nearly everyone in the surrounding area was looking at him with disgust and disapproval. Dr. Wells knelt down beside Kevin's seat, checking his face where Robert had struck him. Let me take a look at that, she said gently. I'm a doctor, so I know what to look for. She examined Kevin's cheek, which was red and slightly swollen but not seriously injured. You're going to have a bruise, but nothing's broken. How's your head? Did you hit it when he pushed you back? Kevin nodded. A little bit, but I think I'm okay. Dr. Wells looked into Kevin's eyes, checking his pupils for signs of concussion. You seem alert and responsive. That's good, but I want the flight crew to take a look at you too, just to be sure. Robert was standing in the aisle now, swaying slightly from the alcohol and his rage. This is ridiculous. I barely touched him. You struck a minor child in the face, Dr. Wells said, standing up to face him again. That's assault, sir, and everyone on this plane witnessed it. Indeed, several passengers had their phones out and had recorded the entire incident. The video evidence would be undeniable. Mrs. Patterson, who had been silent during the intervention, finally found her voice again. Thank you, dear, she said to Dr. Wells. I tried to help, but he wouldn't listen to me. You did exactly the right thing, Dr. Wells assured her. It takes courage to speak up, even when you feel powerless. The commotion had finally attracted the attention of the flight crew. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, came rushing down the aisle with 2 of her colleagues. What's going on here? She demanded, taking in the scene quickly. Kevin's red cheek, Robert's aggressive stance, and Dr. Wells' position protectively in front of the boy told the story clearly enough. This man assaulted this child, Dr. Wells explained calmly. I'm a doctor and I witnessed the entire incident. The boy was struck in the face and then physically shaken. There are multiple witnesses. Lisa's training kicked in immediately. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me, she said to Robert. We have procedures for situations like this. Procedures? Robert laughed bitterly. This whole thing is blown way out of proportion. The kid bumped into me, and I reacted. End of story. The story ends with you assaulting a minor, Dr. Wells said firmly. And frankly, your continued aggressive behavior suggests you're not fit to be around other passengers. More flight attendants had arrived now, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay while we handle a situation on board. Please remain in your seats and remain calm." Kevin was still shaking, but Dr. Wells's presence had made him feel infinitely safer. She sat down in Robert's abandoned seat and spoke to him in the gentle tone she probably used with her young patients. "You handled that very well," she told Kevin. "You stayed calm. You didn't fight back and you asked for help. That shows real maturity." "I was scared," Kevin admitted quietly. "Of course you were scared. Anyone would be. But being scared doesn't make you weak. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it." Kevin looked around at all the passengers who were now showing him support and kindness. The contrast with Robert's hatred was stark and powerful. "Why did he hate me so much?" Kevin asked, the question that had been haunting him throughout the ordeal. Dr. Wells chose her words carefully. "Some people carry anger and hatred inside them that has nothing to do with the people they meet. It's about their own problems, their own fears. It was never really about you, Kevin. It was about what's broken inside him." The flight attendants had escorted Robert to the front of the plane, where he was being held under close supervision. The captain had made the decision to divert to the nearest airport, where law enforcement would be waiting. As the plane began its descent toward the unscheduled landing, Kevin realized that this terrible experience had revealed something important. While one person's hatred had tried to hurt him, many other people's courage and kindness had protected him. Dr. Wells stayed with Kevin throughout the remainder of the flight, ensuring he felt safe and cared for. Other passengers stopped by to check on him and offer their support. What had begun as Kevin's worst nightmare was transforming into something else entirely. A powerful lesson about the choice every person faces when confronted with injustice: to remain silent, or to stand up and make a difference. The plane touched down at Birmingham Airport with a gentle bump that Kevin barely noticed. His mind was still processing everything that had happened over the past hour. What should have been a simple flight to visit his grandmother had become something much more significant. Dr. Wells had stayed beside him throughout the emergency landing, making sure he felt safe and explaining what would happen next. Her calm presence had been like an anchor in the storm of emotions Kevin was experiencing. "The police will need to talk to you," she explained gently as the plane taxied toward the gate. "They'll want to hear your version of what happened. Just tell them the truth exactly as you remember it." Kevin nodded, still feeling overwhelmed by the attention. Other passengers kept turning to look at him with sympathetic expressions. Some had approached during the landing to express their support and apologize for not acting sooner. "I should have stepped in right away," said the military officer who had spoken up earlier. "I'm sorry it took so long for someone to help you." "We all should have done something sooner," added the mother with the 2 children. "But that woman," she gestured toward Dr. Wells, "she's a real hero." Dr. Wells shook her head humbly. "I just did what anyone should do when they see someone being hurt. Kevin's the brave one here. He handled an impossible situation with incredible grace." When the plane finally stopped at the gate, 2 police officers boarded immediately. They spoke briefly with the flight crew, then approached row 14. Kevin's heart started beating faster again. But Dr. Wells squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Officer Martinez," the female police officer introduced herself. "Kevin, I understand you've had a difficult experience today. We're here to make sure you're safe and to find out what happened." Kevin told his story from the beginning, starting with Robert's hostile behavior during boarding and describing how the situation had escalated. Dr. Wells provided her account as a witness, and several other passengers came forward to offer their testimonies as well. Mrs. Patterson, despite being elderly and shaken, insisted on speaking to the police. "That man was horrible to this sweet boy from the moment he sat down," she said firmly. "Kevin didn't do anything wrong. Nothing at all." The police took statements from multiple witnesses and reviewed the video footage that passengers had recorded on their phones. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Robert, meanwhile, had been escorted off the plane in handcuffs. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely when faced with law enforcement. He kept insisting that he'd been provoked and that his actions were justified, but no one was buying his story. "Will I have to go to court?" Kevin asked Officer Martinez. "Possibly, but we'll make sure you have all the support you need if that happens," she replied. "For now, we need to contact your family and arrange for you to continue your trip to your grandmother." Dr. Wells volunteered to stay with Kevin until his grandmother arrived from Atlanta. She'd already called her own family to explain that she would be delayed, putting Kevin's needs ahead of her own plans. While they waited in the airport's family assistance area, Kevin found himself opening up to Dr. Wells about his fears and feelings. She listened with the patience and understanding that came from years of helping children through trauma. "I keep thinking about all those people who watched it happen," Kevin said quietly. "Why didn't they help right away?" Dr. Wells considered the question carefully. "It's something called the bystander effect. When people see something wrong happening, they often freeze up or assume someone else will take action. It doesn't make them bad people, but it does mean we all need to be more aware of our responsibility to help others." "But you didn't freeze up." "No, I didn't. Maybe it's because of my training. Or maybe it's because I've seen too many children get hurt when adults don't step in. But honestly, Kevin, I think anyone could have done what I did. They just needed to make the choice to act." As they talked, other passengers from the flight stopped by to check on Kevin. The military officer, whose name was David, told Kevin about his own experiences with discrimination and how important it was to have people willing to stand up for what's right. The mother, Rebecca, brought her 2 young children over to meet Kevin. "I want them to understand what they witnessed today," she explained. "Both the bad and the good. They need to know that when they see someone being hurt, they should find a way to help." Even some passengers who hadn't been directly involved in the incident approached Kevin to express their support. A young college student named Alex said, "I was recording everything on my phone, but I should have done more. Next time I will." An elderly gentleman named Mr. Johnson shook Kevin's hand firmly. "Son, you showed more dignity and courage today than most adults would have. Your grandmother is going to be very proud of you." 3 hours later, Grandma Betty arrived at the airport, her face etched with worry and anger. She embraced Kevin tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My baby," she whispered, examining his bruised face. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Kevin introduced his grandmother to Dr. Wells, who had stayed the entire time as promised. Grandma Betty hugged Dr. Wells with the same intensity she'd hugged Kevin. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for protecting my grandson when I couldn't." Dr. Wells smiled warmly. "He's an amazing young man. You should be very proud of him." Before they parted ways, Dr. Wells gave Kevin her contact information. "If you ever want to talk about what happened, or if you just need someone to listen, please don't hesitate to call me." 6 months later, Kevin did call Dr. Wells, but not because he was struggling with trauma. Instead, he was calling to invite her to a special assembly at his school, where he would be speaking about bullying and the importance of standing up for others. Kevin's experience on Flight 447 had changed him, but not in the way Robert had intended. Instead of making him feel small and powerless, it had shown him the incredible impact that one person's courage could have. Dr. Wells accepted the invitation and listened with pride as Kevin addressed his entire school. He spoke about his experience without bitterness, focusing instead on the lesson he'd learned about the choice everyone faces when confronted with injustice. "When Dr. Wells stepped in to help me, she didn't just save me from getting hurt worse," Kevin told his fellow students. "She showed everyone on that plane what it looks like to be brave. And because of her courage, other people found their voices too." Kevin had also stayed in touch with several other passengers from the flight. Mrs. Patterson sent him cards on holidays, always reminding him how proud she was of his strength. David, the military officer, had become something of a mentor, helping Kevin understand that real strength comes from standing up for what's right, not from putting others down. Even Rebecca's children had learned from the experience. They'd asked their mother to help them start an anti-bullying club at their elementary school, inspired by Kevin's story. Robert, meanwhile, had faced serious consequences for his actions. He'd been convicted of assault and hate crime charges, resulting in jail time, substantial fines, and mandatory anger management and sensitivity training. The incident had also cost him his job when the video footage went viral on social media. But perhaps most importantly, the incident had sparked conversations about racism, bystander intervention, and the responsibility we all share to protect one another. The video of Dr. Wells confronting Robert had been viewed millions of times, inspiring countless discussions about courage and doing the right thing. During her speech at Kevin's school assembly, Dr. Wells emphasized that heroism isn't about being fearless or having special powers. "It's about making the choice to act when you see someone who needs help," she told the students. Kevin could have responded to that man's hatred with anger or bitterness. Instead, he chose to use his experience to help others. That's the real hero in this story. As Kevin looked out at his classmates that day, he realized that his terrible experience had become something powerful and positive. Robert's hatred had been meant to diminish him, but instead, it had revealed the incredible capacity for good that exists in ordinary people when they choose to care about others. The flight that was supposed to be about visiting his grandmother had become about so much more. It had shown Kevin that while there will always be people in the world who carry hatred in their hearts, there will also always be people willing to stand up against that hatred. And sometimes, that makes all the difference in the world.